That's my mother and Dave Rogers, and at the Kern County Fair, don't know what year. A couple in love, you know. Well, it's painful right now just to think about it. She was so blinded by his love, his affection, his everything for her that she couldn't see anything else. And even if she did see it, she wouldn't let herself believe it. I mean, the man's a monster.
The bodies of a 20-year-old woman and a 15-year-old girl who both worked Union Avenue were found in the same Arvin Canal, both killed with the same weapon. But it was a bombshell when the killer turned out to be a sheriff's deputy, David Keith Rogers.
Mr. David Keith Rogers, yep, this is him. Typical picture of evil. Policemen are supposed to be good people, you know. They're supposed to be. That man cost me a lot right there. It cost my mom, he cost a couple lives. My mom passed away. This man's still alive, and he still has that smug look on it, even though, look where he's at. As taxpayers, we spend $70,000 a year to house this killer here, and that's evil. This is a photo album. My mom kept every article there was to deal with the case and stuff. And as you go through it, she kept a detailed record of all the police articles, and I guess it was to remind her. I don't know, I wouldn't have done that, but you know, she kept everything she could. My feelings at the time was, why torture yourself, you know? But she loved that man, no matter what. This is after he was arrested. I had been through 3 marriages. Mr. Rogers said, when those ended, I figured there ain't no man out there worth having. Then along came David and changed my mind. I never in my whole life had a man open car doors for me. I've never had anyone buy gifts for me for any reason, bring home flowers, hold my hand whenever you go, wherever you go, and wanted to be with you all the time. That's why everything was such a shock, she said, her voice trailing off. We always talked about things, and this other personality just wasn't there. I know it's hard for people to believe. It never surfaced in David, not in his job, not in his home life. That best describes the whole thing. It was the facade he was putting on. I mean, he was a very good person to her, you know, and, you know, she was quite happy, and she did never see it. So that was her opinion of him, and she kept it till the end. She truly loved the man. But his true colors finally came out. That is the wedding picture of them. From the time I met him till they got married was a short amount of time in my eyes. But my mom's happiness was the most important thing. It was everything. I mean, she brought me into this world. She deserved everything she could get. I was happy that he was going to make my mom happy. My father was a drunk, and he abused her a lot. And, you know, he's a cop, so that means he's a good character, supposedly. What, like a wolf in sheep's clothing right there. He is. Bonding with David Rogers was a little hard. We were all staying over there at his house And it was that macho thing, it was his house and the whole thing. He was alpha, he just, dominance, he just projected, you do as I say, and in everything, and, he was a typical. And then being a cop kind of made me nervous. Just as a kid who's doing dumb things, and I was pretty much experimenting with drugs at the time, and it made me nervous, to say the least. He had a garden growing in the backyard and some things to it, and I basically took over the garden, and then I was thinking that'd be the perfect time to sneak in a couple pot plants, because I had them hidden behind some tomato plants, and got away with it for quite a while. And then I came home one day, and it was in my bedroom, sitting on my bed. He found the plants, he pulled them, dirt and all, put them in the middle of my bed. I was waiting for the scolding that's going to come, or the lecture that's going to come behind it, and he could arrest me, for that if he wanted to, because it was a felony at the time. And went to dinner, we sat down at the table, nothing was said. I kept staring at him, he was looking at me. But I think a lot was really said without being said. It was his way of controlling me, making me squirm and enjoying it. The feeling was terrible, actually. And that went on for a while. Just every time I looked at him, always had that shitty grin. Man never said a word. Never, not one word ever mentioned about it. Ever. It ate me up. Is he trying to hold something over me that he can use later on? But yeah, that was definitely his way of showing that, I'm the man, and well, he was in control. And after that, it was just downhill. I was the oldest of my friends. I had the only vehicle, and I couldn't make it home without being pulled over by a sheriff. Anytime I saw a cop on the way on, I knew I was going to get pulled over. And I'm sure he just said, well, let's give this kid let's make him nervous or something like that. I know he did. You get pulled over like 9 different times in one night by sheriffs. He had something to do with that. Got old real fast after the second and third time, we did nothing wrong. He was just messing with me, which really pissed me off. But nothing I can do about it. But yeah, definitely he was getting off on it completely. He always wanted control over everything.
But you also knew he had eyes everywhere, all over town.
Yeah, he did. And, it was going to make my life miserable. When my mom first met him, my mom had a house on Penny Street. It was supposed to be empty. The thing on my mind was party house. There was like 5 of us in there getting high. The next thing you know, there's door flies open and there's 2 policemen standing there. We were all surrounded, light shining on the house, and just the feeling of being trapped in a room like that. And then in the back of my mind, am I going to be okay over this, or is it going to be bad? How it's going to play out. And I had a hard time explaining to him, Dave's my stepdad, you need to call him, this is his house. Right at that instant, the door pops open. And he just walked up, stuck his head into the door and looked around, looked at me. But nothing was said. He gave me that look. Like I can do this at any time. It's the way he did things. He just seemed to show up where we were at all the time. Like, this back before tracking, back before cell phones and everything, but he just seemed to know where I was at all the time. He'd show up just, it's kind of weird now that I think about it. He always showed up. But back, it probably was his way of trying to put his hand on top of me, knowing he squished me at any time. Yeah, they called it the Jeep Posse. They all had Jeeps or four-wheel drives, and they all did everything together. Brothers, basically. That's a typical picture of them. About every other weekend, Dave and my mom on the one end, and then three of us partners and a wife there. It was mostly just a gathering of them eating and drinking. That's what they do. And if the women wasn't involved, the bull started. The men would make a bonfire and sit around it, but I didn't want to be with them. So I just would lay back in the background where no one would see me and just listen and observe. And they're all just telling their stories and cleaning their weapons. Dave stood up all of a sudden like, it's my time, then to tell his story. And he tells a story of how he had arrested a young man, and he just said this guy was getting on his nerve. So he decided he would show him who's boss, and took him down to the river and made him get out of the vehicle and made him kneel by the river. He said, I put my gun to the back of his head, and then he's like, no, I can do this and get away with it. And I'm sure the guy was scared. I'm sure he was. You have control of their life at the moment. I mean, I don't even want to think about it anymore, about that. It was kind of like him when he just stared at me. He gives that person that thought of what could have been. So once again, it's that controlling factor. He is now in control. And then he put him back in the car, and then he just took him to jail. And I was looking for someone to say something about it. Nothing. Which scared me because he's a cop, he's a cop, and they're supposed to protect people. I thought I knew that man. I didn't know he was doing all that to that extreme. Bakersfield wasn't like it is today. Back then, it was actually a small town. Dave Rogers had the prostitution beat. It was Union Avenue from 58 to, all the way to 178. It was basically the bad part of town, because he requested for that beat, there. He lent me the truck numerous times, and I would run across notes that had, information on females, their age and the whole thing. He would take a picture of them. I don't know why he did that. At the time, I was assuming it was part of his job. But now I know that it wasn't, it was leading into something worse. No telling what was in his evil mind. If it was for sexual fantasies or anything, or because he wanted to do something later, or I don't know.
Was it your idea to be a cop, or did Dave suggest it?
I can't really answer that. The sheriff's test came up, I recall that, and I don't know if he encouraged me to do that or I jumped on it. The salary was good, and in a way, I guess I might want to impress him, follow his footsteps or whatever. I really don't know my train of thought at the time, but it sounded like a good thing to do. I would hear him talk to Mom about the authority he had and just his day, he got this crud off the street or he did this and that. And I wanted to be able to do that. If you pull someone over, you're on probation or anything like that, and you do a search, you find a gun and drugs or something like that, he'd just look at the guy and say, well, what's this? And they go, what's what? You know, he goes, exactly. And he'd take the gun, he'd take the drugs. He took them home. That's what he did. And then he abused the women in a different way. God, these poor women too. He pulled over a couple women that were intoxicated. He was going to take the driver to jail for DUI, and he ended up getting her phone number and was going to meet her later. And she didn't get in trouble. She drove away. When he came back to the car, he told me, you know, that's one of the perks of the job. And I was just so confused because he's telling me this, and he's supposed to be loving my mom and the whole works. But how can you love someone and do that?
You think he was testing to see if you'd tell your mom?
That's crossed my mind a few times, but if he was, I passed because I never did.
So why do you think you didn't tell your mom?
I didn't want to hurt her. No, I didn't care about him. Everything was all about her, you know. She was in love with the man. Well, he was a loving husband with her. The only time I ever saw a good day was when Mom was around. When he wasn't with her, he was like a Jekyll and Hyde, you know. He was a whole different person when he wasn't around her or had anything to directly relate to her. There was this one time I was with him on a ride along. He pulled over a good-looking woman, and he said, well, watch this. And yeah, he got her to remove her top, and, you know, he fondled her breast, and like it was nothing, like it was nothing. And then I feel guilty because maybe he did that just to show it to me, you know. Maybe if I wasn't there, maybe he wouldn't have done that. I don't know. This is hard. I just felt bad because of the shame that she had to feel, the way he acted and treated people. It's like he had no regard for me being there, that I'm witnessing this. Not that I was anything special, but I was his wife's son. So, you know, he didn't even act like he was worried that I would repeat it. I don't know if he was testing me, if I could keep a secret or you know, join the brotherhood. I don't know, it makes me feel like I was a bad person too. I didn't do something about it when it happened, which I should have. And so I'm embarrassed about that part of it. And like, you know, I've tried to suppress the thoughts of it for so long. I just know as a decent human being, you can't let people get away with stuff like that, you know. And I was in the position where I could have done something, and it just kept getting worse. I hate people not thinking good about me because I felt I was a good person, and man, there's just so many things I can't say that, you know, he showed me the bad side of what he does. How you get favors by just abuse of power. He got away with it and just kept going and going and going. I didn't do nothing about it, and I should have. And I just don't know. It comes back. I should have done something. Can I have a second, please?
Yeah.
Just for a second.
Let's go ahead and cut.
Sitting in a car watching him do something doesn't mean you had something to do with it. He's a police officer.
Yeah, but I was the one in position to do something about it.
We all have moments in our lives where we wish we could have spoken up and done something. And you don't need to be afraid of the truth.
Let's do what we can do, right?
Let's give it a shot. All right.
Sorry. I really don't know why he confided in me.
It feels like it was something that happened slowly over time.
It escalated to him confiding in me over certain things, like make me be part of him or bond with him or whatever. He dropped the tidbits of it, little bits of information here and there during conversation. If you ever do something real bad, you don't leave evidence. You use the weapon, you get rid of the weapon. You chop it up, chop up the barrel, so the serial number's gone, get rid of it. Anything you wore, anything you drove, if you keep your truck, you put new tires on it. No witness is the best witness for you, and no evidence is the best, So just, you do what you do. And back then there wasn't DNA, hardly just starting and stuff, so you didn't have to worry about that. He thought he was untouchable. There was plenty of little flags along the way. I don't know what I was thinking at the time. I just wanted to, if anything ever happened, I wanted documented proof that, you can't tell a story unless you can prove it. Things I observed and witnessed, everything, anything I witnessed, good and bad. Everything was bad. He found the journal too. I'd left it out. I was just sitting on the couch and I wrote on the coffee table and just left it there. He picked it up, not knowing what it was, and opened it up, and he was he couldn't have been more than a few pages into it when I went in there and I said, "Oh, what do you got in your hand?" It was just a scary thing. Well, I walked in there and saw that it made me nervous that he was reading it. I kind of like, I got caught, my game's up, He goes, "Is this yours?" And I'm like, "Yeah, that's mine. Sure, it seems like it's got a lot of information about me in it." I said, "Well, come on, Dave, what do you expect? I got to remember things. You told me keep information. That's what you do." Because he had always, cops have to write down their stuff so they can remember for the report. So I just writing all this stuff down. I didn't write good, but there wasn't any. He just threw it down on the coffee table and walked away, and wasn't happy. I saw the disappointment in him, thinking that I would do something like that because I was supposed to be part of his family, Like, are you going to use that against me? Or, what? I don't know what he was thinking about it. It changed his opinion on me. It had to. I never talked to him about it, but after he had seen it and everything, but just quit gathering information. I think I lived a little bit that stopped me because of the fear of what could have happened. I was scared as hell. I still don't know to the day what happened to it. I probably did throw it away. I don't know. I feel guilty over it. I'll live with the fact that, I could have, maybe what if I had said something? Why didn't I talk to somebody about it? Anybody, I had no one to confide in, and I did nothing. And it ended up with 2 deaths. It makes me feel like that's when I noticed he had a fixation on prostitutes. We would go driving down Union, which was his beat, and he would say, "Hooker, hooker, stay away from her. She's a cop." It was an obsession with him, and I don't know, it's hard to explain.
I think that you saw other stuff, and I'm curious what else you saw.
That's what I saw. They're just things I'd rather not say.
Well, it feels like in a weird way that you're protecting him a little bit, and I don't
And protecting me. Okay, he got me laid by prostitutes a few times. He hooked me up with some of the girls free of cost because of his power. I'm embarrassed about that. It was just, I mean, it's you know, I don't know. It's to look back, it just to walk into a room with a stranger and then she's all over you, you know. And he had direct involvement in that. You know, he had something over them and he told them to do this. And at the time, I was just getting laid. I mean, and it's not normal. No, not normal at all. You know, I really don't know to this day why. You know, I think in the way he was grooming me to let me know that when you become a cop, this is what you can get away with. Because people are afraid to say anything about it. Maybe that was his way of holding something over me, you know, and he was probably doing that. Both of them. He was not only grooming me, he was having something over my head just in case. I was just so conflicted that, you know, I wanted to do good, but I knew there was something wrong with that man. There was a time there in Dave's career that a prostitute had made the accusation that he had done some pretty heinous things to her. He had picked her up at the Wiener Schnitzel on Union in California, made her get in his car, drove her to Union Cemetery, made her get out of the car, undress, and did numerous things to her, and then drove her back to the Wiener Schnitzel and dropped her off. She went in and complained about it, and he got suspended during the investigation. So that gave me the first notion that he may not be as good as he thought he was.
What did he tell your mom when he got suspended?
He denied it, you know, basically, but he let her believe that it was nothing, that it was all bull, and that, you know, everything will be fine. But I know he did it. You know, he told me he did it. Part of me maybe wished that, you know, she'd find out and leave and stuff like that. I'm almost 100% sure she suspected, but she loved the man and she stayed by him. He asked me if I would help him do something. I said, yeah, I'll help you do anything. What? He said, I need to get rid of a few things. I said, okay, what's that? We went to the shed and we pulled out 2 gunny sacks of, there had to be at least 40 handguns in there, at least. There was a couple sawed-off shotguns. Maybe because the way he acquired them, he was afraid that they would come out to his house. I could just tell he was in a rush, and we took him someplace and we dumped him in the water. Threw him in the deepest part of the river. I bet they're still there today. I was just trying to help the man. But I had that feeling like I'm doing something really wrong right here, right now. Then when court came, the lady did not show up to court, and no ifs, ands, or buts until they had no case. The feeling or the talk around was that, well, maybe he got rid of her. I don't know. She just didn't show up to testify. And that's all they had was her, you know, that's all they had was her. So he got his job back. But they took him straight to the jailhouse. That's where rookies go, you know, that's where you go in the beginning to earn your time to get out on the street. And that made him angry. That's when it all went downhill. That's when the vaccination and everything got heated towards hookers because of what she did. I think he was mad because that one tried to take his life away from him or something. He's got some resentment. You know, he hated hookers after that. He hated all women except my mom. He just looked at women, looked at them all, yeah, like, sluts, whores, all the above. And he was going to make them pay one way or another. It was a normal day on February the 13th, a Friday. I was working down at the truck stop when my neighbor from across the street called and told me, Tony, there's at least a dozen cop cars at your mom's house, And he said, Tony, what happened? And I said, I don't know. And I went and told my manager, I said, I gotta go. I just hauled ass there. And I went in there, Mom, are you okay? I was more concerned about her. I was just consoling her, and it was so loud in there with all the officers talking. And so that's when I officially found out what his charges were for. Murder, two counts of it. And they were all discussing, who's setting him up, who's trying to black, none of them believed it. None of them believed it. Phone rang, and I think I was the only one who heard it. So I went and I got it, and then I picked it up, and it was that message from the jailhouse saying, you have a call from, Kern County. And I said, hello? And he goes, Tony, let me talk to your mom. She got the phone, and everybody kind of quieted down a little bit. And then it happened. I mean, she slid down in the chair, she turned white, and she said he confessed. She said he confessed. That was the beginning of the end. I mean, I'll never forget that moment in my life. I saw the life drain from my mother, right then, because that was her everything, everything. I lost my mom that day. Unfortunately, that's Janine Benintendi, and I think she was 21 years old. A young prostitute. I think he killed Janine probably early 86. She had been in the canal for quite a few days and was unrecognizable. I mean, they had to go through fingerprints to get her, even though her hands were swollen. I guess somehow they got fingerprints off of her and they were able to match her up in the database. That's how they found out that was who she was. And they had no clue whatsoever. But she was shot 6 times with the .38. He was even investigating, part of the investigation team that was investigating for that. Investigating a murder he did, but nobody knew. Then I was wondering, well, what was he in there, to try to do something to cover it up, but he didn't need to, because they had nothing at all. I mean, he got away with the first one for a year and 11 days. They would have never busted him on that. They would have never found out, ever. And the second one, Tracy Clark, same canal, same gun, same everything.
So the same gun was used in both murders?
Yes, sir. Same gun, same ammunition. This picture is Tracy Clark, one of his second victim. I think she just got into town that night. And he shot her once, kicked her out of the truck, drove away, came back, and then emptied the gun in her. Then when they did the ballistics, and it was the same gun. She was like 15 and a half years old, and I think she was 6 weeks pregnant. 15 and a half. Wow. I'm sorry for that. And then how many did he do that they don't know about is a thing too. They were investigating the 11 unsolved murders that were related to homeless women or prostitutes or something like that. They asked him a whole bunch of times about that, and he never denied anything. He didn't say he didn't do anything. But yeah, he did two that we know, and no telling how many that could have been. I don't know.
Rogers was tried and convicted of both murders, and in 1988, his penalty phase of the trial began, the time for jurors to decide if he should be sentenced to life without parole or death. They chose death.
What do you want people to understand about how this all affected your mom?
That there's more than one victim in it. And she loved that man, no matter what. And she stayed by him. She didn't believe it at all, no matter how hard I tried to convince her, and to the point where I said bad things, and none of it worked. That's love. She was in love with the man, and I don't understand. I tried to get her to stop, but it just wouldn't work. You can't make someone stop loving. My mom went approximately every 3 months. Once he got sentenced up there and finally got to San Quentin, about the first 5 years, it was every 3 months. She'd go up there and spend the night. But then it got expensive, and she just couldn't do it. And her health started failing. But I think the total was 14 times she saw him before she had to stop. She stayed home. She didn't go nowhere. She waited for phone calls. She waited for letters. And then to watch her suffer for the 12 years she suffered after that is really painful. I never even thought about forgiving him. In fact, I hate him more today than I did back then. Morro Bay. That was a picture of my mother and me. She was happy. She loved going to the beach and loved going camping. And I just called her over and took a picture, and God, she looked happy. I would consider myself mama's boy. I took care of her, and she took care of me. I miss that woman. But that was in her time of happiness right there, just waiting to be shattered. I mean, I wrote him a letter there after my mom passed away. I poured my heart into it and told him how I was the final nail in the coffin. I don't give a what happens to him now, you know. He should have died a long time ago. It's just not right. I didn't deserve it. She didn't deserve it. The two girls' families didn't deserve it. And I didn't even think about any of this stuff until this, you know, I tried to block it all out. And when my mom passed away, I thought I was done with that, you know. That part of my life is gone and stuff like that. But guess what? It'll never leave. It'll never leave.
The rain over Houston had a way of arriving without warning, as if the sky itself had decided to forget mercy. On April 16, 1997, it came in slow, heavy sheets that blurred the outlines of River Oaks into something softer, almost dreamlike. Behind the tall hedges and wrought iron gates, the neighborhood looked untouched by time, insulated by wealth and silence. But inside one of those houses, something irreversible was already in motion, waiting only for the right moment to reveal itself. At first, nothing about the Angleton home seemed out of place. It was another residence among many in a district where privacy was not a privilege but an expectation. The lawn was trimmed, the driveway clean, the windows shut against the rain. Yet later, investigators would describe a strange stillness in the air that afternoon, as if the house had been holding its breath for hours. Inside that home lived Doris Angleton, a woman whose name would soon become inseparable from suspicion, tragedy, and unanswered questions. To the outside world, she was part of a wealthy Houston marriage, the wife of a man known for his success in the shadowy world of gambling operations. But behind closed doors, her life had become something far more fragile than the polished exterior suggested. Doris had been married to Robert Angleton, a man whose business dealings were never fully visible, but always deeply felt. He moved through the world of bookmaking and underground betting with the ease of someone who understood risk better than trust. Money flowed through his life in unpredictable currents, sometimes abundant, sometimes concealed. With that money came scrutiny, and with scrutiny came pressure that eventually seeped into the marriage itself. Friends would later describe Doris as someone who had begun to change in the years leading up to her death. There was a quiet tension in her voice when she spoke about the future, a sense that something in her life no longer fit. The marriage that once held promise had become a structure built on fractures. Arguments about finances grew sharper, more frequent. Trust, once assumed, now had to be negotiated. The couple shared twin daughters, and for a time, those children were the only stable point in a relationship otherwise drifting apart. But stability has a way of becoming fragile when the foundation beneath it starts to erode. Doris began to consider separation. In a world like River Oaks, divorce was not just an emotional rupture, it was a financial earthquake. And earthquakes, as everyone in Houston understood, always left damage beneath the surface that took years to fully reveal. Robert Angleton did not welcome the idea of separation. Those who knew him said he was a man who preferred control, not compromise. The prospect of losing half of everything he had built, both in wealth and reputation, hung over him like a threat that could not be ignored. Whether spoken aloud or not, it was understood that divorce would not be simple. It would be expensive, messy, and deeply personal. And then there were the rumors, the kind that follow couples when silence becomes too loud. Doris was said to have been seeing someone else. Nothing ever fully confirmed, nothing ever fully denied. But in a marriage already strained by money and secrecy, even suspicion could become combustible. By the spring of 1997, the household had become a place where conversations were measured carefully, where emotions were contained rather than expressed. On the surface, life continued. The children went to school. The house remained intact. But beneath that normality, something was shifting into place, like a storm forming beyond the horizon where no one was looking. On the morning of April 16th, Doris left the house to run a simple errand. She was going to pick up items for her daughter's sports activities, a routine task that should have taken little time. There was nothing unusual in her departure, nothing that suggested finality. She walked out of the home and into a day that, at first, looked no different from any other. But she would not return. Hours passed. The rain continued to fall, softening the edges of the city. Robert Angleton returned home later with the children. What he encountered inside the house was not immediately clear to those outside, but the sequence of events that followed would soon become the center of a murder investigation that captivated Houston. The front door was found slightly open. Not forced, not broken, just open enough to feel wrong. Inside, the atmosphere shifted from ordinary domestic space to something colder, more charged. The kind of silence that does not belong in a lived-in home. The kind that signals absence in its most violent form. When authorities arrived, they found Doris Angleton inside the residence. She had been shot multiple times, the injuries concentrated in the face and upper body. The scene carried no signs of forced entry, no clear indication of struggle that would suggest a stranger had broken in. Instead, everything pointed toward something far more intimate. Whoever had done this had either been invited in, or had never needed to break in at all. That detail alone changed the trajectory of the investigation. It removed randomness from the equation. It suggested planning, familiarity, access. And in cases like this, access often meant family, or someone close enough to be trusted without question. The house itself told a story in fragments. Objects were undisturbed in places where chaos might have been expected. There was no overturned furniture, no shattered glass scattered across rooms. It was as if the violence had been precise, targeted, and brief. A moment of interruption in an otherwise orderly environment. For investigators, that absence of struggle was as important as any physical evidence. It suggested that Doris had likely known her attacker, or at least did not perceive them as a threat until it was too late. In homicide investigations, that distinction narrows the field significantly. Strangers rarely enter quietly and leave without disruption. People who are known do. As news of the murder spread through River Oaks, shock moved quickly through the community. This was not a neighborhood accustomed to violent crime. The scale of wealth and insulation created an expectation of safety, even if that expectation was sometimes more psychological than real. Now, that illusion had been disrupted. In the days that followed, attention turned almost immediately to the Angleton family. Robert Angleton's name surfaced in early conversations, not as an accusation, but as a focal point of inquiry. In cases where spouses are killed inside their homes, law enforcement often begins with the person closest to the victim. Proximity, emotional and physical, becomes a starting point rather than a conclusion. But as detectives began digging deeper, the case began to expand beyond a simple marital investigation. There were financial complexities. There were questions about Robert's business dealings. There were whispers of connections that extended beyond domestic conflict into something more structured, more deliberate. And then, unexpectedly, another name entered the picture. A name that would transform the case from a domestic tragedy into something far more convoluted. Roger Angleton. Robert's brother. Unlike Robert, Roger lived in a far more unstable world. He had a history of legal trouble, and his behavior had long been described as erratic by those who encountered him. When authorities eventually became aware of him, it was not through family connection, but through a separate investigation that led police to him for unrelated reasons. What they found during that interaction changed everything. In Roger's possession were materials that appeared to connect directly to Doris Angleton's murder. Among them was an audio recording that allegedly captured a conversation discussing the killing. The content of that recording immediately raised questions that would define the case for years to come. Voices discussing money. Voices discussing planning. Voices discussing a woman who was already dead. But audio evidence, especially in cases involving familiar voices, is rarely as straightforward as it appears. Identity can be disputed. Context can be unclear. An interpretation can become a battleground where truth and doubt compete without resolution. As investigators listened to the recording, one question began to dominate every discussion. If this was real, who was speaking? And if it was not, then who had created it and why? The case had already shifted once. It would not take long before it shifted again. The city of Houston in the mid-1990s carried a particular kind of energy, a mixture of ambition and heat, where glass towers reflected both sunlight and secrecy in equal measure. In neighborhoods like River Oaks, that energy became something quieter, more controlled, as if wealth itself demanded silence from the streets it occupied. Behind the gates and manicured hedges, life was designed to look effortless, even when it was anything but. The Angleton residence fit perfectly into that landscape. From the outside, it was just another home shaped by architectural restraint and financial success. Clean lines, expensive materials, and an atmosphere that suggested order. But order, in homes like this, often hides tension rather than removing it. And in the case of Robert and Doris Angleton, that tension had been building for years in ways that were not always visible, even to those closest to them. To understand the environment in which Doris lived, you have to understand the man she married. Robert Angleton was not a public figure in the traditional sense, but within certain circles he was known as someone who understood money in motion. Gambling, bookmaking, and underground betting networks formed the invisible structure of his professional life. It was a world built on risk calculations, silent agreements, and the constant balancing of trust and deception. In such a world, relationships are rarely simple, because every connection carries a price, even when it is not immediately visible. Doris entered that world through marriage, not by choice of profession, but by proximity. At first, there may have been the illusion of stability, the belief that wealth could create safety. The early years of their marriage reportedly carried moments of normalcy, even happiness. But over time, the nature of Robert's work began to cast longer shadows into their domestic life. Phone calls that ended when she entered the room. Conversations that shifted tone when asked too many questions. A growing awareness that parts of her husband's life existed in places she was never fully allowed to see. Living with that kind of opacity changes the rhythm of a household. Trust becomes less of a foundation and more of a negotiation. Doris began to notice details that once seemed insignificant, but gradually formed a pattern. Late nights that were never fully explained. Financial movements that were difficult to trace. Emotional distance that widened during moments that should have brought closeness. None of these things alone were definitive, but together they created an atmosphere where certainty was always just out of reach. Friends and acquaintances would later recall that Doris seemed increasingly aware of this imbalance. There was a subtle shift in how she carried herself in conversations, as if she was measuring her words more carefully. She was not a woman who spoke openly about private matters, but even silence can reveal strain. In social settings, she maintained composure, yet those who knew her well sensed that something beneath the surface was unsettled. The marriage, by the mid-1990s, had entered a stage where separation was no longer an abstract idea. It had become a possibility that was being considered seriously, even if not yet fully acted upon. Divorce in their world was not simply an emotional decision, it was a financial and legal battlefield. Property, assets, and influence were all intertwined. In the Angleton household, ending a marriage would not mean simply walking away. It would mean unraveling a shared structure built over years, where every thread was tied to money, reputation, and control. Robert understood this better than most. Those who observed him described a man who did not easily surrender control over outcomes, especially those involving significant financial stakes. Whether or not he explicitly discussed divorce with Doris in confrontational terms remains part of the uncertainty that surrounds the case, but the tension between them had reached a point where silence itself became a form of communication. What was not said mattered as much as what was. At the same time, Doris was not isolated from the world outside her marriage. There were suggestions, never fully confirmed in a legal sense, that she had begun to rebuild parts of her emotional life elsewhere. Whether this represented a serious relationship or simply an emotional connection is unclear, but in the context of an already strained marriage, even perception could become a source of conflict. In environments defined by secrecy and suspicion, certainty is rarely required for tension to escalate. Belief alone is often enough. Within the household, the presence of their twin daughters added another layer of complexity. Children in unstable marriages often become silent witnesses to dynamics they cannot fully understand. For Doris, they represented both responsibility and grounding, a reason to maintain stability even when stability felt increasingly artificial. For Robert, they were part of a shared life that complicated any potential separation. Custody, access, and financial support would all become contested issues in the event of divorce. Nothing in the situation was simple, and nothing could be resolved without consequence. By early 1997, the emotional structure of the marriage had become fragile enough that even ordinary days carried undercurrents of tension. Conversations were shorter. Decisions were more cautious. The atmosphere inside the home resembled a space where both presence and absence were equally heavy. It is in such environments that small actions begin to carry disproportionate weight. A delayed response. A closed door. A missed call. Each becomes part of a larger narrative that both sides interpret differently. Outside the household, Robert's world continued to operate in its own rhythm. Business dealings, meetings, and arrangements tied to gambling operations required constant attention. That world did not pause for domestic instability. Instead, it often intensified it, because pressure in one area of life rarely remains contained. It spreads, slowly and unpredictably, into other areas where control is more difficult to maintain. Doris, meanwhile, was navigating her own internal shift. The idea of leaving a long-term marriage is rarely sudden. It develops gradually, through accumulated moments of dissatisfaction and reflection. In her case, it appears that this process had reached a stage where separation was being actively considered. The practical implications of such a decision in her financial and social environment would have been significant. It meant legal proceedings, negotiations over assets, and public exposure of private matters that had previously been kept behind closed doors. In Houston's upper social circles, reputation carries its own form of currency. A divorce involving wealth and alleged illicit business connections would not remain private for long. It would become part of local conversation, reshaping how both individuals were perceived. For someone like Doris, this would have been an additional burden layered on top of emotional uncertainty. As the relationship continued to deteriorate, the gap between public appearance and private reality widened. To outsiders, the Angleton marriage still existed. There were no public announcements, no visible collapse. But inside the home, the structure was already shifting into something unstable. It was a situation where two people could occupy the same space yet live in entirely different emotional realities. What makes cases like this so difficult to reconstruct is that the most important moments are rarely recorded. They exist in conversations behind closed doors, in decisions made without witnesses, in thoughts never spoken aloud. By the time the outside world becomes aware that something is wrong, the internal timeline has already advanced beyond easy reconstruction. In the weeks leading up to April 16th, there was nothing that publicly indicated an imminent tragedy. Life continued in its expected form. The children attended their routines. The household maintained its external appearance. Yet beneath that surface, the conditions that would later define the investigation were already in place. Financial pressure, emotional distance, and unresolved conflict formed a structure that would soon reach a breaking point. Houston would later remember 1997 through many events, but within the Angleton home, that year became defined by a quiet build-up towards something irreversible. Not a single dramatic moment, but a gradual tightening of pressure that eventually demanded release. And when that release came, it would do so in a way that left behind more questions than answers, drawing investigators, family members, and the public into a story that refused to resolve itself cleanly. What remained in the aftermath was not just a crime scene, but a fractured narrative. One where love, money, suspicion, and silence had all become indistinguishable from one another, setting the stage for a case that would challenge certainty. At every step that followed, Doris McGowan Angleton was not the kind of person who filled a room with noise. She entered spaces the way some people enter water, slowly, carefully, as if measuring depth before committing herself fully. Those who met her in social settings in Houston often described a woman who observed more than she spoke, who listened with an attention that suggested she was always processing something just beneath the surface of conversation. To understand Doris is to understand the contrast she lived inside. On one side was the world of River Oaks, with its polished surfaces, controlled appearances, and unspoken rules about what should and should not be revealed. On the other was the emotional reality of her marriage, which by the mid-1990s had become increasingly difficult to reconcile with that polished exterior. She existed in the space between those two worlds, trying to maintain a sense of identity that did not collapse under the pressure of either. Friends remembered her as composed, but not detached. There was warmth in her interactions, especially when she spoke about her daughters. The twins were often described as the center of her emotional life, the one part of her world that felt unambiguous. In conversations, she would soften noticeably when their names came up, as if the rest of her life required careful navigation, but they represented something pure enough not to be questioned. Her marriage to Robert Angleton had once carried the structure of conventional success. Wealth, children, a home in one of Houston's most prestigious neighborhoods. From the outside, it was the kind of life that suggested stability. But stability in appearance is not the same as stability in reality. Over time, the foundation of their relationship shifted, not through a single rupture, but through a series of small fractures that gradually weakened everything holding it together. Doris began to live with an increasing awareness that her husband's world was not fully accessible to her. Robert's work in the gambling and betting industry was not simply a job, it was an ecosystem built on secrecy. Money moved in ways that were difficult to trace. Relationships existed in layers of trust that could not always be verified. In such an environment, information itself becomes controlled currency, and those outside the system are kept at a distance, even when they are closest in proximity. That distance eventually became emotional as well as practical. Doris could sense it in the way conversations would shift when certain topics arose. In the pauses that lasted a second too long before answers were given. In the sense that there were parts of her husband's life that would never be fully explained, not because they were explicitly hidden from her, but because they were never meant to be shared at all. Over time, that lack of access creates its own kind of loneliness. It is not the loneliness of physical absence, but the loneliness of partial presence. Living beside someone while knowing that entire sections of their life exist beyond your reach creates a tension that is difficult to resolve. Doris did not speak publicly about this experience, but those close to her noticed a gradual shift in her emotional tone. She became more reserved in certain discussions, more reflective in others, as if trying to decide how much of her internal world should remain private even from those she trusted. At the same time, she was navigating the social expectations that came with her environment. In River Oaks, appearances carried weight. Marriages were not only personal arrangements, but also public representations of stability and success. Ending one was not a simple private decision. It had social and financial implications that extended beyond the individuals involved. For Doris, the idea of separation meant stepping into a process that would expose private details to scrutiny, something she seemed increasingly aware of as the months progressed. What complicated her position further was the financial structure of her marriage. Robert's wealth was not straightforward. It was tied to systems that did not operate in the open, which meant that any legal separation would not only involve dividing assets, but also unraveling a financial web that was difficult to fully map. This created a situation where leaving the marriage was not just emotionally challenging, but structurally complex. Those who knew Doris during this period sometimes described moments of hesitation in her demeanor, as if she was standing at the edge of a decision she had not yet fully committed to making. Divorce was not just an end, it was a transformation of identity, lifestyle, and security. It meant redefining herself outside of a structure she had lived within for years. And like many people facing such a threshold, she appeared to move between resolve and uncertainty. There were also subtle indications of emotional distance within the marriage itself. Not dramatic confrontations, but the quieter erosion of intimacy that often goes unnoticed until it becomes irreversible. Conversations that once flowed easily became more guarded. Shared routines continued, but without the same emotional alignment. In many relationships, it is not conflict that signals breakdown, but the absence of connection in moments that used to carry meaning. Doris's life outside the marriage remained relatively contained. She was not known for public displays of personal struggle. Instead, she maintained the kind of composure that often masks internal conflict. To casual observers, she appeared to be managing her life with control. But control and resolution are not the same thing. It is possible to maintain outward stability while internally moving toward change that has not yet been expressed. Her relationship with her children remained central throughout this period. The twins represented continuity in a life that otherwise felt increasingly divided. In them, she found a form of clarity that was absent elsewhere. Decisions about their well-being likely influenced many of her considerations about the future, as they do in most families facing instability. The question was not only what she wanted for herself, but what kind of environment she wanted to preserve or escape for them. In households like the Angletons, even silence carries meaning. What is not said between two people can become more significant than what is. There is a kind of communication that happens through absence, through delay, through avoidance of certain topics. Over time, this creates a shared understanding that something is unresolved, even if neither person fully articulates it. Doris and Robert existed in that space of unspoken awareness, where the outlines of conflict were visible even if the details were not openly acknowledged. By early 1997, the emotional distance between them had reached a point where separation was no longer a distant possibility. It was something that existed as a near-term reality, even if it had not yet been formally initiated. In situations like this, relationships often enter a phase of suspended tension, where both individuals understand that change is coming but have not yet decided how or when it will occur. This period is often the most unstable, not because of action, but because of anticipation. When an ending becomes likely, but has not yet happened, every interaction is colored by that awareness. Conversations carry subtext. Decisions carry weight beyond their immediate purpose. Even ordinary routines become charged with meaning because they exist on the edge of transition. Doris's story, at this stage, is not defined by a single dramatic event, but by accumulation. A life built within a structure that no longer feels secure. A marriage that continues in form, but not in emotional substance. A future that is being considered in private, without yet being fully spoken into existence. And within that quiet build-up lies the central tension of her story. Not what happened in a single moment, but how many moments led to the point where everything could no longer remain the same. Doris Angleton's final morning, as far as anyone can reconstruct it, began like many others in a household that had learned how to perform normality even when normality no longer felt natural. The house in River Oaks was quiet in the way affluent homes often are during mid-morning hours, when children are at school and adults are occupied with routines that keep life structured. Outside, Houston was already moving through its familiar rhythm of traffic, heat, and humidity, the kind of atmosphere that presses down gently on everything beneath it, making even ordinary movements feel slower, heavier. Inside the Angleton residence, There was nothing immediately visible that would suggest that this day would become the center of a criminal investigation that would later span years. No signs of panic, no unusual disturbance in the visible order of the home. Yet in cases that later become defined by violence, the absence of visible disruption is often one of the first details that stands out in retrospect. It suggests a kind of familiarity between victim and offender, a breach that does not require force, because access has already been granted in some form. Doris had left the house earlier that day for what was described as a routine errand connected to her children's activities. It was the kind of task that blends into the fabric of everyday life, unremarkable in its purpose, predictable in its timing. She was expected to return. There was no indication from those who knew her that anything about her behavior that morning suggested hesitation or fear. Life, at least on the surface, was continuing within its expected boundaries. But something changed between the moment she left and the moment she never came back. When Robert Angleton later returned home with the children, the sequence of events that unfolded inside the house would become the subject of intense scrutiny. The front door was found in a state that would later be described as slightly ajar, not violently breached, not destroyed, but positioned in a way that immediately felt wrong to those who later examined the scene. It is often these subtle deviations from normality that alert investigators that something significant has occurred, because they indicate presence without permission, movement without explanation. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. Homes carry emotional temperature, and those who enter after a violent act often describe a difference that is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. It is not simply silence, but a kind of silence that feels enforced, as if the space itself has absorbed sound. Rooms that should feel lived in instead feel paused, suspended in a moment that no longer belongs to the present. When authorities were called and eventually arrived, they entered a scene that would become central to the case. Doris Angleton was found inside the residence, deceased from multiple gunshot wounds. The injuries were concentrated in areas that suggested close or controlled targeting, and the absence of signs indicating forced entry immediately shifted the investigative focus. This was not a random intrusion. There was no evidence of a struggle that would suggest an unknown attacker breaking into a secure home. Instead, everything about the scene pointed toward access, familiarity, and timing. Investigators are trained to read scenes not only for what is present, but for what is missing. In this case, what was missing was chaos. There were no overturned objects suggesting a fight that moved through the space. No broken windows or signs of forced penetration. No indicators of a burglary gone wrong. The orderliness of the environment stood in stark contrast to the violence that had occurred within it, creating a contradiction that demanded explanation. This contradiction became one of the defining features of the early investigation. When violence enters a domestic space without leaving external signs of intrusion, the circle of potential suspects narrows almost immediately. The focus shifts inward, toward relationships, access, and emotional proximity. In other words, toward people who did not need to break in, because they were already part of the environment. In the hours and days that followed, attention naturally turned toward the dynamics of the household itself. Robert Angleton, as the husband, became a central figure in the initial stages of inquiry, not as an immediate conclusion, but as a procedural starting point. In homicide investigations involving spouses, this is standard practice. The person closest to the victim is often the first to be examined, not because of assumption, but because proximity is a factual condition that must be accounted for in any reconstruction of events. As investigators began to map out the timeline of the day, they also began to reconstruct the emotional and financial context surrounding the marriage. What emerged was a picture of increasing strain, not defined by a single incident, but by a pattern of deterioration that had been building over time. Financial complexity, emotional distance, and unresolved tension formed the backdrop against which the investigation unfolded. The absence of forced entry continued to weigh heavily on early interpretations of the scene. It suggested that Doris may have known her attacker, or at minimum, did not perceive them as a threat until it was too late to react. In domestic homicides, this detail is often one of the most telling, because it transforms the nature of the crime from external intrusion to internal collapse. The danger does not come from outside the life of the victim, but from within it. As the investigation expanded, additional layers of complexity began to surface. Attention moved beyond the immediate household and into the broader network of relationships surrounding Robert Angleton. His business dealings in gambling operations introduced questions about financial motives, external pressures, and potential conflicts that extended beyond the domestic sphere. These elements did not provide answers, but they widened the scope of inquiry, making the case more intricate with each new detail. At the same time, investigators began to encounter inconsistencies and gaps that prevented any immediate conclusions. Information did not align neatly into a single narrative. Instead, it fractured into multiple possibilities, each supported by fragments of evidence, but none fully conclusive on its own. This is often the point in an investigation where certainty begins to erode, replaced by competing interpretations of the same facts. The home itself became a focal point of forensic examination. Every room was analyzed not only for physical evidence, but for spatial understanding. How movement may have occurred within the space. Where an encounter might have taken place. How someone familiar with the layout could navigate it without disruption. These questions transformed the residence from a family home into a reconstructed environment of hypothetical movement and intent. Yet even with detailed examination, no single narrative fully emerged from the physical evidence alone. The scene was too controlled, too contained, too lacking in the kind of disorder that often accompanies violent struggle. This absence of clarity created space for speculation, and speculation quickly became part of the case's broader trajectory. What remained undeniable, however, was the finality of the act itself. Doris Angleton's life ended inside a space that was meant to represent safety, stability, and family. The contrast between what a home symbolizes and what occurred within it would become one of the most haunting aspects of the case as it moved forward. By the time the initial phase of the investigation concluded, what investigators had was not a clear answer, but a framework of uncertainty. A timeline with missing emotional context. A scene that suggested familiarity rather than intrusion. A family structure that was already under strain before violence entered the picture. And at the center of it all remained a question that would define everything that followed. Not only who committed the act, but how a life built within a protected domestic space had reached a point where such an act became possible at all. The first officers, who entered the Angleton residence on April 16, 1997, did not yet know they were stepping into a case that would resist closure for decades. What they saw was not chaos in the traditional sense of a violent intrusion, but something more unsettling, a domestic space that appeared almost too intact, as if life had been interrupted rather than violently overturned. It is this kind of scene that often unsettles investigators most, because it refuses to immediately declare what kind of crime has taken place. Instead, it leaves interpretation open, and interpretation is where uncertainty begins. The initial discovery of Doris Angleton's body set the tone for everything that followed. She was found inside the home, the result of multiple gunshot wounds, and positioned in a way that suggested the act had been deliberate and controlled rather than chaotic or impulsive. The absence of forced entry immediately narrowed the scope of suspicion in a procedural sense, but it also complicated the emotional narrative of the case. When violence enters a home without breaking it open, it forces investigators to consider that the danger may have already been inside the life of the victim. As crime scene units moved through the residence, they began the slow process of documenting everything, not just the obvious, but also the seemingly insignificant. In cases like this, every object becomes a potential witness. The placement of furniture, the condition of doors, the state of personal belongings, even the subtle indications of movement through rooms are all recorded with meticulous attention. What they were searching for was not just evidence of how Doris died, but how someone had been able to move through a private space without leaving the expected signs of intrusion. The lack of struggle in visible form was one of the earliest points of emphasis. There were no shattered windows, no overturned tables, no clear path of disruption that would suggest a confrontation between stranger and victim. Instead, the home retained a kind of deceptive order, as if the violence had been contained within a very specific moment rather than spread across the environment. That kind of scene often suggests familiarity, because familiarity reduces resistance. A person who is not perceived as a threat does not need to force their way in, physically or emotionally. As investigators documented the scene, attention began to shift toward reconstructing the timeline of the day. Doris had left the home earlier for what was described as a routine errand, an ordinary departure that, in hindsight, became the final confirmed moment of her being seen alive. Between that departure and the discovery of her body, there existed a gap that would become the central space of speculation. In that gap, investigators would attempt to reconstruct movements, interactions, and opportunities. The husband, Robert Angleton, quickly became part of that timeline reconstruction. Not as an immediate conclusion of guilt, but as a necessary point of reference. In homicide investigations, especially those involving domestic settings, the spouse is not treated as a suspect by default, but as a critical source of information regarding the victim's last known movements, routines, and emotional state. What investigators look for first is not accusation, but structure. Who knew what, and when? Robert's account of the day, like most initial statements in such cases, was treated as a starting point rather than a definitive narrative. Investigators carefully compared his version of events with physical evidence, witness statements, and available timelines. What they were trying to determine was whether the story of the day aligned with the physical reality of the scene, or whether there were inconsistencies that required deeper examination. At the same time, detectives began to map out the broader environment surrounding the Angleton household. This included financial records, communication patterns, and known associations connected to Robert's business activities. His involvement in gambling operations introduced an additional layer of complexity, because it placed him within a network where secrecy and informal arrangements were common. In such environments, official documentation often tells only part of the story, and investigators must rely on indirect indicators to fill in the gaps. As this broader investigation unfolded, attention also turned to Doris herself, not only as a victim, but as a person whose life might contain contextual clues about motive or conflict. Her relationships, her recent emotional state, and any indications of distress or change in behavior were all examined. What emerged was a portrait of a woman navigating increasing instability within her marriage, though the exact nature and extent of that instability remained subject to interpretation. The absence of forced entry continued to stand out as one of the most significant physical findings. It suggested that the person who committed the act either had direct access to the home, or was allowed entry without resistance. In either case, it implied a level of familiarity that immediately narrowed the field of potential suspects. In domestic homicides, this is often the turning point in investigative focus, where attention shifts from unknown external threats to known internal relationships. As forensic analysis continued, investigators examined the trajectory and nature of the gunshot wounds, attempting to understand the positioning of both victim and offender during the incident. While such details cannot provide emotional context, they can offer insight into physical dynamics. The controlled nature of the injury suggested that the encounter may have been brief, deliberate, and executed with a degree of precision that indicated intent rather than chaos. Meanwhile, the emotional atmosphere among family members and close associates began to shift from shock to scrutiny. In cases like this, grief is often quickly accompanied by questions, and questions quickly evolve into speculation. The Angleton family found itself at the center of a widening circle of attention that extended beyond law enforcement into public curiosity and media interest. As detectives continued their work inside the home, they also began interviewing individuals connected to both Doris and Robert. These interviews were essential not only for gathering information, but for identifying inconsistencies or corroborations in personal accounts. In many investigations, it is through repetition and comparison of statements that hidden details begin to surface, not necessarily because someone lies outright, but because memory, perception, and emotional bias shape how events are recalled. What became increasingly clear during this phase was that the case could not be understood solely through the physical scene. The home provided a framework, but not the full narrative. The emotional, financial, and relational dynamics surrounding the couple were becoming just as important as the forensic evidence itself. Investigators were now dealing with a case that existed simultaneously in two spaces: the physical space of the crime scene and the psychological space of human relationships. By the end of the initial crime scene processing, the investigation had already begun to move beyond the question of what happened inside the house and toward the more complex question of why it happened at all. The absence of forced entry, the controlled nature of the violence, and the domestic context all pointed toward a scenario that could not be explained by randomness or external intrusion. Instead, what emerged was a case defined by proximity. A crime that did not enter the home from outside, but appeared to arise from within its existing structure. And with that realization, the investigation entered a new phase, one in which the boundaries between family, motive, and suspicion would begin to blur in ways that would shape everything that followed. The investigation into Doris Angleton's murder did not unfold as a straight line. Instead, it fractured almost immediately into competing theories, overlapping timelines, and personalities that pulled the case in different directions. What began as a domestic homicide investigation quickly expanded into something far more complex, where family relationships, financial pressure, and psychological instability became entangled in a web that detectives struggled to untangle with certainty. From the earliest hours after the crime scene was secured, investigators understood that this would not be a simple case of identifying an unknown intruder. The absence of forced entry had already narrowed the field significantly, and the controlled nature of the violence suggested a level of familiarity that shifted attention inward. But narrowing suspicion is not the same as solving a case. It only changes the shape of the uncertainty. The first phase of the investigation focused heavily on Robert Angleton. As the husband of the victim, his position in the timeline was unavoidable. Detectives examined his movements on the day of the murder, his statements, and his emotional responses. They were not only looking for inconsistencies, but also for patterns that might indicate knowledge beyond what a spouse would normally have. In many domestic cases, it is not a single contradiction that reveals the truth, but a collection of small discrepancies that begin to form a larger picture. Robert's world, however, complicated that picture. His involvement in gambling operations meant that his life was already layered with secrecy. Cash flows were difficult to trace. Relationships within that environment were often informal and unrecorded. This made it harder for investigators to distinguish between legitimate ambiguity and deliberate concealment. In a more conventional profession, financial records and communication logs often provide clarity. In Robert's world, they provided fragments. As detectives worked through these challenges, they expanded their inquiry beyond the immediate household. Friends, associates, and business contacts were interviewed. Each conversation added detail, but rarely provided resolution. Some individuals described Robert as controlled and calculated, while others avoided giving clear impressions altogether, often emphasizing that they did not know enough to speak definitively. That kind of uncertainty is not unusual in cases involving semi-private financial networks, but it made the investigative process slower and more dependent on inference. At the same time, attention began to shift toward another figure, who would eventually become central to the case: Roger Angleton, Robert's brother. Unlike Robert, Roger did not operate within a structured business environment. His history was marked by instability, legal issues, and behavioral unpredictability. Where Robert represented financial complexity, Roger represented psychological volatility. Together, they created a dynamic that investigators found difficult to interpret without caution. Roger's entry into the case did not occur through direct suspicion at first, but through an unrelated legal matter that led authorities to his possession of materials connected to Doris Angleton's murder. Among these materials was an audio recording that immediately drew attention. The content appeared to involve a discussion related to Doris and the circumstances of her death. For investigators, this shifted the case into a new phase, because it introduced the possibility of premeditation or coordination. However, audio evidence in criminal investigations is rarely straightforward. The question was not only what was said, but who was speaking, under what circumstances, and with what intent. Voice identification, context interpretation, and authenticity all became central issues. The recording raised as many questions as it answered, and in doing so, it complicated the already uncertain narrative. When Roger was detained in connection with separate charges, investigators had an opportunity to examine his statements more closely. His behavior during questioning and his possession of materials related to the case deepened suspicion, but did not provide clarity. Instead, it created a dual possibility. Either Roger was directly involved in the crime, or he was entangled in a situation that he did not fully understand, but could not escape. The situation escalated dramatically when Roger Angleton died in custody. His death, ruled as a suicide, introduced a turning point that altered the trajectory of the investigation. Shortly before his death, he left behind a written statement in which he claimed responsibility for Doris Angleton's murder and suggested that Robert was not involved. This declaration immediately became one of the most controversial elements of the case. For investigators, the statement created a difficult dilemma. On one hand, it appeared to be a confession from someone directly linked to the case. On the other hand, Roger's psychological state, his history of instability, and the timing of his statement raised questions about its reliability. Was this a genuine admission of guilt, or an attempt to reshape the narrative in the final moments of his life? Was it truth, manipulation, or something in between? The prosecution would later argue that Roger's confession could not be taken at face value. They suggested that it might have been part of a broader effort to obscure the truth, whether by protecting someone else, or by constructing an alternate version of events that could not be fully challenged after his death. The absence of cross-examination or further clarification meant that his statement existed in isolation, without the legal scrutiny that typically tests the reliability of confessions. As Roger's involvement became more prominent, the investigation entered a phase of increasing complexity. Instead of narrowing toward a single suspect, the case expanded into competing interpretations of the same evidence. The audio recording, Roger's confession, Robert's financial and emotional context, and the forensic findings from the crime scene all existed simultaneously, but they did not converge into a single coherent explanation. This fragmentation had a significant impact on how the case was prepared for trial. Prosecutors had to build a narrative strong enough to account for multiple uncertainties, while defense arguments focused on those same uncertainties to challenge the reliability of the state's interpretation. In the absence of direct eyewitness testimony, or definitive physical evidence linking Robert to the act itself, the case became heavily dependent on inference and association. Meanwhile, the emotional dimension of the investigation continued to affect everyone involved. Doris Angleton's family was left navigating a landscape where answers were constantly shifting. Each new development introduced the possibility of resolution, followed almost immediately by renewed doubt. That cycle of expectation and uncertainty is one of the most difficult aspects of prolonged investigations, because it prevents closure from forming in a stable way. By the time the case moved toward formal charges, the investigation had accumulated layers of complexity that extended far beyond the initial crime scene. What began as a domestic homicide had evolved into a narrative shaped by financial secrecy, psychological instability, disputed recordings, and a posthumous confession that could not be fully verified. The central challenge for investigators was no longer simply identifying who might have been involved, but determining how to construct a legally coherent case from evidence that resisted singular interpretation. In that sense, the investigation itself became part of the story, reflecting the difficulty of translating human relationships and ambiguous actions into a definitive legal conclusion. What remained constant throughout this phase was the absence of absolute certainty. Every potential explanation carried weaknesses. Every suspect carried ambiguity. And every piece of evidence, rather than closing the case, seemed to open new questions that pulled the investigation further into uncertainty rather than away from it. The turning point in the Doris Angleton case did not arrive with a dramatic revelation or a single piece of irrefutable evidence. Instead, it came in the form of accumulation, a slow convergence of contested materials, emotional pressure, and investigative persistence that gradually forced the case into the courtroom. By the time prosecutors prepared to present their argument, the story they had constructed was no longer just about a murder inside a quiet River Oaks home. It had become a narrative involving financial motive, familial connection, disputed audio evidence, and a posthumous confession that refused to settle into a single interpretation. The decision to pursue charges against Robert Angleton was not made lightly. Investigators and prosecutors had already spent months dissecting the physical evidence, reviewing timelines, and attempting to reconcile conflicting accounts. What they had was not a direct eyewitness, nor a weapon conclusively tied to a single perpetrator, but rather a network of circumstantial elements that, when viewed together, suggested involvement at a level sufficient to proceed to trial. The absence of certainty did not prevent prosecution, but it did shape the nature of the case from the beginning. As preparations intensified, the prosecution team focused heavily on constructing a coherent narrative that could withstand the defense's anticipated challenge. At the center of their argument was the idea that Doris Angleton's death was not a random act of violence, but a planned event rooted in domestic and financial conflict. Robert's alleged motive, according to prosecutors, was tied to the prospect of divorce and the potential financial consequences that would follow. In their interpretation, the marriage had reached a breaking point where separation represented not just emotional separation, but a significant restructuring of wealth and control. However, motive alone was not sufficient in a courtroom. The prosecution also needed to address the physical evidence, which did not directly place Robert at the scene in a definitive way. This is where the case became particularly complex. The lack of forced entry, the controlled nature of the crime scene, and the domestic setting all created a framework that was suggestive, but not conclusive. In legal terms, suggestion is not enough. The burden of proof required a stronger connection between intent, opportunity, and action. The most controversial element introduced during this phase remained the audio recording associated with Roger Angleton. Prosecutors argued that the recording contained discussions that indicated premeditation and possible coordination. They presented it as a key piece of circumstantial evidence linking the broader Angleton family dynamic to the murder. However, the defense immediately challenged its reliability, questioning both the authenticity of the voices and the context in which the recording was made. In their view, the audio was ambiguous at best and potentially misleading at worst. This dispute over the recording became one of the central battlegrounds of the trial. Expert witnesses were called to analyze voice patterns, background noise, and technical aspects of the recording process. Yet even with expert input, certainty remained elusive. Audio evidence, unlike physical evidence such as fingerprints or DNA, carries inherent limitations. It depends heavily on interpretation, and interpretation can be influenced by expectation. The defense strategy focused on these uncertainties. They emphasized the lack of direct physical evidence linking Robert to the act of killing Doris. No murder weapon was recovered that could be definitively traced back to him. No eyewitness placed him at the scene in a manner that directly contradicted his account. Instead, the case relied on inference, association, and interpretation of indirect evidence. For the defense, this was not enough to meet the legal threshold required for conviction. They also addressed the issue of Roger Angleton's involvement in a way that reframed the narrative entirely. Roger's confession, made before his death in custody, was presented as a critical alternative explanation. According to the defense, Roger's own statements indicated that he had played a direct role in the crime, and that Robert was not involved. While the prosecution dismissed this confession as unreliable due to Roger's psychological state and lack of cross-examination, the defense argued that it could not be ignored simply because it was inconvenient to the state's theory. This tension between two competing interpretations of the same individual's actions became one of the most emotionally charged aspects of the trial. On one side, prosecutors suggested that Roger's confession was part of a broader pattern of manipulation or confusion, possibly designed to obscure the truth or protect others. On the other side, the defense positioned it as a direct admission of responsibility from the only person who had openly claimed involvement. Inside the courtroom, these arguments played out not just as legal positions, but as competing narratives about human behavior, trust, and intent. Jurors were asked to evaluate not only facts, but also the credibility of interpretations built around those facts. In many ways, the trial became less about a single moment of violence and more about how fragmented pieces of information should be assembled into a coherent story. Witness testimony added further layers of complexity. Individuals who knew the couple were brought in to describe their impressions of the marriage, the emotional dynamics between Robert and Doris, and any relevant observations about behavior in the months leading up to the murder. These testimonies varied widely, reflecting the subjective nature of personal relationships. Some described tension and distance, while others emphasized normalcy and the absence of visible crisis. This inconsistency did not necessarily weaken the case for either side, but it reinforced the difficulty of constructing a singular truth from human perception. Financial records and business associations were also examined in detail. Prosecutors attempted to establish a link between financial pressure and potential motive, suggesting that divorce would have created significant consequences for Robert's financial structure. The defense countered that financial complexity alone could not be interpreted as evidence of intent to commit murder. Wealth and legal disputes, they argued, are common in divorce cases and do not inherently imply criminal behavior. As the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that the outcome would depend not on a single decisive piece of evidence, but on how jurors interpreted the totality of ambiguous information presented to them. The case required them to weigh absence against presence, possibility against probability, and narrative coherence against reasonable doubt. When the prosecution finally rested its case, the courtroom atmosphere reflected the weight of uncertainty that had built over weeks of testimony. The defense then presented its argument with a focus on dismantling the idea of a unified narrative. They emphasized fragmentation, inconsistency, and the danger of drawing conclusions from incomplete information. In closing arguments, both sides attempted to reframe the same evidence in fundamentally different ways. For the prosecution, the evidence formed a pattern that pointed toward guilt when viewed as a whole. For the defense, That same pattern was a collection of disconnected elements that could not sustain a conviction beyond reasonable doubt. When the case was finally handed to the jury, the decision was not simply about whether a crime had occurred, but about whether the evidence presented could overcome the inherent uncertainty that surrounded it. The absence of definitive proof created a space where interpretation became decisive, and interpretation is shaped as much by perception as by fact. The verdict, when it came, reflected that tension. Robert Angleton was acquitted of the charge of capital murder. The jury concluded that the evidence, while suggestive, did not meet the legal standard required for conviction. In a case built on circumstantial connections and disputed interpretations, reasonable doubt remained intact. The conclusion of the trial did not resolve the case in the broader sense. Instead, it marked a legal endpoint within a story that continued to exist outside the courtroom. Questions about responsibility, involvement, and truth persisted, shaped by the unresolved nature of the evidence and the competing narratives that had defined the proceedings. The breakthrough that brought the case into court did not ultimately produce closure. Instead, it revealed the limits of legal interpretation when confronted with fragmented evidence and deeply intertwined personal relationships. What remained was not resolution, but the recognition that some cases resist final clarity even after they have been fully examined in a court of law. The courtroom where Robert Angleton stood trial was not large by modern standards, but on the days the case was heard, it felt compressed by something heavier than architecture. It was not just the weight of legal proceedings, but the emotional density of a story that had already spilled far beyond the walls of a house in River Oaks. People filled the benches not only to observe a trial, but to try to understand a question that had already begun to shape itself in public consciousness. How does a marriage end in this way? And why does certainty feel so difficult even when death is undeniable? Inside that space, every detail seemed amplified. The sound of chairs shifting. The pause between questions. The way witnesses hesitated before answering, as if searching for a version of memory that would not collapse under scrutiny. At the center of it all stood Robert Angleton, a man whose expression rarely shifted in ways that could be easily interpreted. To some observers, he appeared composed. To others, distant. But courtroom demeanor is a language that is often misread, because silence can mean control, or it can mean disconnection, and the difference is rarely visible from the outside. The prosecution built its case carefully, layer by layer, aware that they were not presenting a story with clean edges. They did not have a murder weapon that could definitively anchor guilt. They did not have a direct eyewitness. What they had instead was a structure of inference, constructed from relationships, financial pressures, and disputed evidence that required the jury to connect meaning across gaps. At the center of their argument was the idea that the death of Doris Angleton was not an isolated act, but the outcome of escalating tension within a marriage defined by control, secrecy, and financial entanglement. The prosecutors described Doris as a woman approaching a decisive turning point in her life, a moment where separation was no longer theoretical, but increasingly inevitable. They framed this transition not as a single decision, but as a process that created instability within the household. In their interpretation, Robert Angleton faced a convergence of emotional and financial consequences that, when combined, created motive strong enough to consider extreme action. To support this narrative, they returned repeatedly to the absence of forced entry in the home where Doris was killed. That detail, which had been central from the beginning of the investigation, took on symbolic weight in the courtroom. It suggested familiarity. It suggested access. It suggested that whoever entered that space did so without resistance, which in turn implied a relationship that had already dissolved barriers of trust or fear. In the language of prosecutors, it was not just evidence of how someone entered a house, but evidence of what kind of relationship existed between the victim and the person responsible for her death. They also revisited the audio recording connected to Roger Angleton, presenting it as a fragment of a larger narrative that extended beyond a single individual. The recording was played, analyzed, and dissected in court, with experts offering competing interpretations of its meaning. For the prosecution, it represented a window into planning and coordination. For the defense, it remained ambiguous, a piece of information too unstable to carry the weight assigned to it. As the recording was discussed, attention repeatedly returned to the question of identity. Who was speaking, and under what circumstances? The courtroom became a space where technology met uncertainty, where scientific analysis could narrow possibilities, but not eliminate doubt. Even expert testimony could not fully resolve the ambiguity, and in that space of uncertainty, both sides found room to argue. Witnesses who had known Doris were called to describe her life, her state of mind, and the condition of her marriage. Their testimonies did not form a single unified picture. Instead, they created overlapping impressions that sometimes aligned and sometimes conflicted. Some described tension and emotional withdrawal in the marriage. Others emphasized normalcy and the absence of visible crisis. This contradiction did not surprise seasoned legal observers, because human relationships rarely produce consistent external perceptions, especially when viewed from different social or emotional distances. When Doris's life was described in court, she emerged as a figure defined by transition rather than resolution. A woman balancing family responsibilities, financial complexity, and personal uncertainty. The prosecution attempted to position her as someone moving toward independence, while the defense emphasized the lack of concrete evidence that she had reached any final decision. In both interpretations, her internal intentions remained partially inaccessible, as they often do in cases where private life becomes public record. The defense strategy focused on dismantling the coherence of the prosecution's narrative. Rather than presenting an alternative story that directly explained what had happened, they concentrated on breaking the connections between pieces of evidence. They emphasized the absence of physical proof linking Robert Angleton directly to the act of killing Doris. No forensic evidence placed him at the precise moment of the crime in a way that could eliminate reasonable doubt. No weapon was conclusively tied to him. No direct eyewitness testimony confirmed his involvement. Instead, what remained was a collection of associations, interpretations, and circumstantial links. The defense argued that these elements, while suggestive, did not meet the legal threshold required for conviction. They highlighted the danger of constructing certainty from fragmented evidence, especially in a case involving complex family dynamics and disputed audio material. Roger Angleton's posthumous confession became one of the most emotionally charged elements of the trial. The defense presented it as a critical piece of information that could not be ignored, arguing that it represented a direct admission of responsibility from an individual closely connected to the case. The prosecution, however, challenged its reliability on multiple grounds. They pointed to Roger's psychological instability, his history of erratic behavior, and the fact that his statement could not be subjected to cross-examination. In their view, the confession existed in isolation, without the safeguards that typically validate or challenge such claims in a courtroom setting. This clash over Roger's role created a deeper philosophical divide within the trial. It was not only about whether he was involved, but about how the legal system should interpret statements made outside the structure of formal testimony. Could a confession made in private, under uncertain circumstances, carry the same weight as evidence tested through adversarial process? Or did its lack of scrutiny render it fundamentally unreliable? As the trial progressed, jurors were placed in the difficult position of navigating between competing narratives that each had internal logic, but lacked completeness. The prosecution asked them to see patterns across fragmented evidence. The defense asked them to resist the temptation of pattern recognition, and instead focus on what could be definitively proven. Between these two approaches lay the space of reasonable doubt, which became the central battleground of the case. Closing arguments brought the emotional and intellectual tension of the trial into sharper focus. The prosecution spoke of motive, opportunity, and a sequence of circumstances that, in their view, pointed toward responsibility. They urged jurors to consider not only individual pieces of evidence, but the overall structure they formed when viewed together. The defense responded by returning repeatedly to absence, emphasizing that suspicion is not proof and that uncertainty must, by law, favor the accused. When the case was finally handed to the jury, the courtroom entered a period of suspended anticipation. Outside that room, the city of Houston continued its ordinary rhythms, but inside, time felt compressed into a single unresolved question. The jurors were not only deciding a verdict, they were deciding how to interpret a story that refused to align itself neatly with either certainty or denial. After deliberation, the verdict returned, not guilty. Robert Angleton was acquitted of capital murder. The decision reflected not necessarily a declaration of innocence in moral terms, but a legal conclusion that the evidence presented did not eliminate reasonable doubt. In the structure of the courtroom, doubt is not a weakness. It is a boundary that protects against certainty built on incomplete understanding. When the verdict was read, the emotional reaction in the room was restrained but heavy. There was no eruption of clarity, no sense that the story had resolved itself cleanly. Instead, there was a recognition that the legal process had reached its limit. The court could determine whether the evidence met a threshold, but it could not resolve every unanswered question embedded within the case. For Doris Angleton's family, and for those who had followed the trial closely, the outcome did not produce closure in the emotional sense. The case had moved through investigation, indictment, and trial, yet the underlying questions remained partially intact. What happened inside that house in River Oaks continued to exist as a narrative shaped by competing interpretations rather than a single definitive explanation. The courtroom confrontation had ended in a verdict, but not in resolution. And in that gap between legal conclusion and human understanding, the case of Doris Angleton remained suspended, defined as much by what could not be proven as by what had been presented within the boundaries of law. After the verdict was delivered in the capital murder trial of Robert Angleton, the courtroom did not erupt into anything resembling resolution. There was no clean emotional release, no universal sense that truth had finally been revealed and accepted. Instead, what lingered was a kind of suspended silence, the kind that follows a conclusion that is procedural rather than existential. The legal system had spoken within its boundaries, but the story that had brought everyone there refused to remain contained within those same limits. Outside the courthouse, Houston continued its normal rhythm, traffic moving along familiar routes, businesses reopening the next morning, life continuing in ways that made the violence inside a River Oaks home feel both distant and unresolved at the same time. For Doris Angleton's family, the aftermath was not defined by the outcome of the trial, but by the persistence of absence. A verdict can close a case file, but it does not restore presence. It does not reconstruct the everyday existence of a person who is no longer there. What remained for them was a life reorganized around an event that could not be undone, and a narrative that had been examined in court, but not emotionally resolved. The twins who had once lived in that house were now growing up in the shadow of a story that would follow them in fragments, through headlines, through conversations they could not fully avoid, and through the quiet gaps left by a mother who would not return. In cases like this, time does not function as healing in a linear way. It functions more like layering. New years accumulate over the moment of loss, but they do not erase it. Instead, they sit on top of it, creating a life that moves forward while still carrying the weight of something unresolved beneath the surface. For those closest to Doris, the question of what happened inside that house in April 1997 did not disappear with the end of the trial. It simply changed form, becoming something that existed alongside memory rather than replacing it. Robert Angleton, having been acquitted, left the courtroom without a conviction, but not without consequence. Public perception does not always align with legal outcomes, especially in cases that attract intense media attention. Even in the absence of a guilty verdict, suspicion can persist in the public imagination, shaped by the fragments of evidence that were presented during trial. The audio recording, the financial background, the family dynamics, and the involvement of Roger Angleton all remained part of a narrative that continued to circulate beyond the courtroom's jurisdiction. In the years following the trial, Robert's life became increasingly defined by legal and financial scrutiny unrelated to the murder case itself. Authorities continued to examine aspects of his financial activities, eventually leading to convictions tied to tax-related offenses and gambling operations. These developments, while separate from the homicide trial, contributed to the public's ongoing perception of him as a figure surrounded by complexity and controversy. Yet even these later legal outcomes did not directly resolve the central question of Doris's death. They existed alongside it, but did not replace it. Meanwhile, the case itself began to take on a different life within investigative and media circles. True crime narratives often evolve over time, especially when a case contains unresolved or disputed elements. The Angleton case became one of those stories that refused to settle into a single definitive interpretation. Instead, it existed as a collection of competing possibilities, each supported by fragments of evidence, but none capable of fully displacing the others. The involvement of Roger Angleton remained one of the most persistent points of ambiguity. His posthumous confession continued to be debated in discussions about the case, both legally and informally. For some, it represented a crucial admission that pointed away from Robert's involvement. For others, it remained unreliable due to the circumstances under which it was made and the absence of cross-examination. In the absence of Roger himself, the statement existed in a kind of evidentiary isolation, powerful in its emotional impact, but unstable in its legal weight. This ambiguity became one of the defining characteristics of the case's long-term legacy. Unlike cases that reach a clear resolution through either conviction or definitive exoneration supported by overwhelming physical evidence, the Angleton case remained suspended between interpretations. It was not a case that concluded in certainty, but one that concluded in legal finality while leaving interpretive space open. Over time, investigators, journalists, and true crime analysts revisited the case repeatedly, each attempting to reconstruct a coherent sequence of events from the available material. The absence of forced entry, the controlled nature of the crime scene, the financial complexity of Robert's life, and Roger's involvement were all re-examined through different analytical frameworks. Some interpretations lean toward conspiracy within the family structure, while others emphasize the lack of direct evidence linking Robert to the act itself. Neither perspective fully eliminated the other. In psychological terms, the case became an example of how human minds attempt to resolve uncertainty by constructing narrative coherence. When evidence is incomplete, the mind naturally seeks patterns, connections, and motivations that can transform fragments into story. In the Angleton case, however, those narratives remained unstable, because each attempted explanation encountered gaps that could not be fully closed. The result was not resolution, but parallel interpretations that continued to coexist. For law enforcement professionals who had worked on the case, the aftermath represented a different kind of reflection. Investigations that end in acquittal often prompt internal review, not necessarily as failure, but as an examination of the limits of available evidence. The Angleton case highlighted the challenges inherent in prosecuting crimes that lack direct physical linkage between suspect and act. It underscored the difficulty of relying on circumstantial evidence in environments where relationships, finances, and personal histories are deeply intertwined. The crime scene itself, long after it had been processed and analyzed, remained a point of reference in discussions about the case. It represented a moment frozen in time, one that suggested familiarity rather than intrusion, control rather than chaos. Yet even that interpretation was not absolute. Crime scenes can suggest patterns, but they cannot fully reconstruct intention. They can indicate possibility, but not always certainty. In the Angleton case, that limitation became central. As years passed, the story of Doris Angleton became part of a broader cultural landscape of unresolved true crime cases in the United States. It was discussed not only as a legal matter, but as a narrative about marriage, trust, secrecy, and the limits of investigative clarity. The combination of domestic setting, financial complexity, and disputed evidence made it a case that resisted simple categorization. It was neither a clear-cut, solved case nor an active ongoing investigation. It existed in a middle space, defined by what had been legally concluded and what had never been definitively proven. For those studying criminal behavior, the case offered insight into how domestic environments can conceal layers of complexity that are not immediately visible from the outside. It demonstrated how financial pressure and emotional distance can intersect in ways that create unstable environments, even when outward appearances suggest normalcy. Yet it also demonstrated the danger of overinterpreting circumstantial connections, especially in the absence of definitive forensic linkage. In the broader public imagination, the case continued to raise questions that extended beyond the specifics of one family. It touched on themes of trust within intimate relationships, the reliability of perception in emotionally charged environments, and the extent to which legal systems can or cannot fully reconstruct truth from incomplete evidence. These are not questions that remain confined to a single case file. They persist because they reflect broader human uncertainties about how much of reality can ever be fully known. Even decades after the events in River Oaks, the image of that house on the day Doris disappeared continues to function as a symbolic anchor for the case. A domestic space that appeared intact, yet contained within it a moment of irreversible rupture. A family structure that outwardly maintained its form, while internally moving toward fragmentation. And a legal process that ultimately reached a verdict, yet could not transform uncertainty into complete understanding. The aftermath of the Doris Angleton case, therefore, is not a conclusion in the traditional sense. It is an ongoing presence shaped by memory, interpretation, and unresolved questions. It exists in the space between what was proven in court and what remains uncertain in human understanding. And in that space, the case continues to endure, not as a closed chapter, but as a story that still resists final explanation, years after the trial ended and the headlines faded from the front pages of Houston newspapers. The murder of Doris Angleton continued to exist in a strange space between memory and mystery. Most criminal cases eventually settle into one of two categories. They are either remembered as solved crimes, where the legal outcome aligns with public understanding, or they remain unsolved, where uncertainty is openly acknowledged. The Angleton case belonged fully to neither category. A woman had been murdered. A suspect had been prosecuted. A jury had rendered a verdict. Yet the questions surrounding the crime remained active, refusing to disappear beneath the passage of time. As the years moved forward, people who revisited the case often found themselves returning to the same central paradox. The circumstances surrounding Doris's death seemed too suspicious to ignore, yet the evidence presented at trial had proven insufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This tension created a lasting sense of incompleteness. The legal process had reached its conclusion, but the human search for explanation had not. In River Oaks, the neighborhood where the crime occurred, life eventually resumed its familiar appearance. Lawns continued to be trimmed. Luxury vehicles continued to move through quiet streets lined with old trees. New families moved into homes, while older residents carried fragments of memory about a murder that had once captured the attention of the entire city. Yet beneath the appearance of continuity, the story lingered. Certain events become embedded in the identity of a place, not because they happen frequently, but because they violate expectations so completely that they leave a permanent mark on collective memory. The murder of Doris Angleton represented exactly that kind of violation. River Oaks symbolized security, privilege, and insulation from many of the dangers associated with urban crime. The idea that a woman could be killed inside her own home, under circumstances suggesting familiarity rather than intrusion, challenged assumptions about what wealth and status could protect against. The case became a reminder that violence often emerges not from strangers lurking outside the gates, but from conflicts already present within them. For investigators who had worked the case, the passage of time brought a different kind of reflection. Homicide detectives often carry unresolved cases with them long after official proceedings conclude. Even when a prosecution occurs, unanswered questions can linger. In private moments, investigators revisit timelines, witness statements, and pieces of evidence, wondering whether a detail was overlooked or whether a different interpretation might have changed the trajectory of the case. The Angleton investigation was the type of case that invited such reflection, because it never offered the comfort of complete certainty. The physical evidence remained frozen in history, unable to evolve or explain itself further. The crime scene photographs, forensic reports, and investigative files contained the same information they always had. What changed over time was not the evidence itself, but the perspective through which people viewed it. New investigators, journalists, and researchers approached the case with different assumptions, different experiences, and different questions. Yet despite these fresh perspectives, no interpretation emerged that could fully close the gaps left by the original investigation. One of the enduring sources of fascination remained the role of Roger Angleton. His life and death became inseparable from discussions of the case. His confession, written before his suicide, existed almost like a ghost within the narrative. It hovered over every attempt to reconstruct events, impossible to fully accept and impossible to completely dismiss. If the confession was truthful, it changed the meaning of the entire case. If it was deceptive, it represented one final act of confusion in a story already defined by uncertainty. The difficulty was that Roger could never be questioned again. He could not clarify his intentions, explain his statements, or respond to challenges. His words remained frozen in time, subject to interpretation, but forever beyond verification. This transformed his confession into one of the most controversial pieces of evidence in the case's legacy. It became a document that people either trusted or doubted depending largely on how they viewed the rest of the evidence. The audio recordings associated with the investigation occupied a similar position. Technological evidence often carries an aura of objectivity, but the Angleton case demonstrated how complicated such evidence can become when context is disputed. Voices can be analyzed. Sound patterns can be compared. Experts can offer opinions. Yet interpretation still plays a role, especially when recordings are incomplete or ambiguous. Years later, the recordings continued to generate debate among those who studied the case, not because they provided certainty, but because they seemed perpetually close to it without ever fully arriving there. For the Angleton daughters, the long-term aftermath likely carried dimensions invisible to the public. Children who lose a parent through violence often grow up not only with grief, but with an inherited narrative shaped by media coverage, legal proceedings, and public speculation. Their mother's death was not simply a private family tragedy. It became a matter of public discussion, dissected by strangers, who would never fully understand the emotional reality behind the headlines. Navigating that legacy requires a different kind of resilience, one that involves carrying personal loss through environments where that loss is continually revisited by others. The broader public interest in the case also reflected something deeper about human psychology. People are drawn to mysteries not merely because they want answers, but because unresolved stories force them to confront uncertainty itself. In everyday life, most people operate under the assumption that major events eventually reveal their causes. Crimes are solved. Motives are understood. Responsibility is assigned. The Angleton case challenged that expectation. It suggested that even extensive investigations, courtroom proceedings, and years of analysis may still leave essential questions unanswered. This challenge is one reason why the case remained relevant long after the trial concluded. It became more than a homicide investigation. It became a study in ambiguity. Every major element of the story contained competing interpretations. The marriage could be viewed as deeply fractured or merely strained. The financial motives could be considered compelling or circumstantial. Roger's confession could be seen as truthful or unreliable. The audio recordings could be interpreted as incriminating or inconclusive. Each perspective contained enough evidence to survive scrutiny, but not enough to eliminate alternatives. As time passed, the story of Doris Angleton gradually shifted from contemporary crime reporting into the realm of true crime history. Researchers revisited it not because new evidence emerged, but because it illustrated enduring themes that appear in many complex homicide cases. Trust and betrayal. Family loyalty and family conflict. Wealth and secrecy. The limitations of evidence. The difference between legal certainty and personal belief. These themes ensured that the case remained relevant even when its specific details faded from public memory. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the story is how ordinary its beginning appears in retrospect. A woman leaves home to handle routine responsibilities connected to her children. A family exists within the familiar rhythms of suburban life. Nothing outwardly signals that this ordinary day will become the dividing line between before and after. Yet that is often how tragedy arrives. Not with dramatic warning, but hidden inside normal moments that reveal their significance only later. The house where Doris died eventually became just another property in a city filled with them. New memories replaced old ones. Different people occupied different spaces. Time moved forward as it always does. Yet somewhere within archived files, courtroom transcripts, and personal recollections, the story remained preserved. A snapshot of a life interrupted and a mystery that never completely surrendered its secrets. The legacy of Doris Angleton is therefore not defined solely by the violence that ended her life. It is also defined by the questions that survived her death. Questions about truth, accountability, and the limits of certainty. Questions that continued to echo long after investigators left the scene, long after jurors returned their verdict, and long after the city resumed its routine. In many ways, those unanswered questions became part of the case itself, shaping how it would be remembered for generations.